want to make a habit of letting great players get out of the building. Just like I said earlier in the week, you just can't let him get out of the building.
Breaking news in a CBS Sports HQ where Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are both getting paid. The Bengals agreeing to contract extensions with their two-star wide receivers.
The Cincinnati Bengals have one of the best offenses in all of football. They have an elite quarterback, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, and another elite receiver opposite of him. But there's just one problem, the defense. But that problem is about to get a whole lot worse because of their own wide receivers, and their front office refuses to look at the bigger picture. Now, is this something that could be solved? Well, a brand new decision that the Bengals made seems to have given us an answer. So before we get to the content, make sure you drop like, subscribe, and turn on our notifications to get the latest off-season news to your device. And now that we get all that out of the way, work! Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? The Cincinnati Bengals have one of the best rosters on paper. They have an elite quarterback in Joe Burrow, a top 3 receiver in the NFL in Jamar Chase, and another elite option across the field from him in T. Higgins. Not to mention the diamond in the rough that they found in Chase Brown a few drafts back. But there's just a few problems. One, according to Pro Football Focus, the organization's offensive line is a collective 60.2 grade. In other words, a D-. This isn't anything new, because, fun fact, Joe Burrow is the 7th most sacked quarterback in NFL history in his first 5 seasons. And look at the other names on this list: David Carr, Neil Lomax, Ken O'Brien. In fact, other than Russell Wilson and Randall Cunningham, this isn't exactly good company to be a part of. Plus, let's just take a look at it from Burrow's perspective. He has missed so many games in his first 5 years that he's won Comeback Player of the Year twice. You can't risk injuring Joe Burrow any further with this mediocre offensive line play. But there's another problem the Bengals are facing, and it has to do with the other side of the ball. You see, despite having one of the worst offensive lines in the NFL, the Cincinnati Bengals have one of the best offenses in the NFL, but their defense is so terrible that it's still not enough for this team to be competitive, particularly in 2024. And this is without mentioning the large amount of talent and personnel leaving this offseason. Lou Anarumo, the team's 6-year defensive coordinator, resigned after this season and went to the Colts. Now, why does this matter if the defense was so bad? Well, because the final 18.8 points per game that they gave up during their season-ending 5-game winning streak can be called into question and doubted. That 18.8 mark is really solid, but they can't even count on that now that the man who called the defense is gone. But that's without going into the large roster turnover happening on the defense. Sam Hubbard, a hometown hero, a Cincinnati kid who grew up in the city, went to college in Ohio, and played his entire career for the Cincinnati Bengals, just retired. And he was the heart and soul of that defense, but it gets even worse. Trey Hendrickson, a man who earned first-team AP All-Pro honors this season, has over a sack per game over the last 2 years combined, and is single-handedly the best defensive player on the Bengals, who is set to be leaving as well. And it's all the Cincinnati Bengals' fault, and they didn't really do anything to fix that.
The Bengals are never going to, issue out lots of guarantees and contracts. Unfortunately, they've just continued to be way behind times in that spot. An old way of doing things, but if you don't ever change, you're going to always get left behind in these situations.
Andrew Whitworth is right here. At least historically he is. The Bengals of the past usually just let their best players walk in free agency or trade them for draft capital, which, judging by their lackluster facilities, is a sign of how cheap the ownership really can be. But like I briefly mentioned, that was the Bengals of the past. The Bengals of the present just paid Jamar Chase and T. Higgins nearly $70 million per year, and even though they just paid their stars, this decision just crippled them financially and might go down as the worst decision in the NFL offseason. Let's compare this situation to a team that was in the exact same situation last offseason. The Philadelphia Eagles had both their number 1 wide receiver A.J. Brown and their number 2 wide receiver Devontae Smith eligible for contract extensions. They extended Devontae Smith for about $25 million a year, and then they paid A.J. Brown about $30 million a year. And this is before wide receivers started resetting the market. This is before Justin Jefferson Jefferson got paid $35 million a year. This was before CeeDee Lamb got paid $34 million a year. They were the first ones to extend them, and now when you compare them to T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, the Philadelphia Eagles were able to retain their wide receivers for $100 million less collectively than the Cincinnati Bengals were able to retain their top two wide receivers. This entire season, the most important players on the team have been putting pressure on Duke Tobin to re-sign both T. Higgins and Jamar Chase.
I want to make a habit of letting great players get out of the building, just like I said earlier in the week. You just can't let him get out of the building.
Control, I wish I could sign T myself and have him with me, for eternity, but 100% possible, You got to play chess in that situation, but it's possible.
Even T. Higgins' own mother was on social media blasting the Bengals for not re-signing her son. And for starters, let me just say this. Is it good to have some input from your team's biggest superstars on player personnel? Absolutely. I mean, after all, they are the ones that are performing on the football field. But not if they're literally holding you hostage and conspiring against your team. And that's not an exaggeration or hyperbole. According to Ari Meirov, in a savvy leverage move, T. Higgins switched agents a few months ago, hiring Rocky Arcana, which is the same agent as Jamar Chase, knowing that the Bengals wanted to keep Chase and that Joe Burrow wanted T. Higgins to stay. Arcana told the team no Jamar Chase deal without T. Look, from a player standpoint, this is absolutely awesome. Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase all get to play together like they wanted to, and they all get paid. But from an organizational team building perspective, this is a horrific mistake. The Bengals are now paying Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase nearly $125 million combined. Now, obviously, that $125 million figure isn't exactly correct. That's purely based on average annual value, and the cap hit will differ based on void years, guarantees, and how the money is spread out. But this is just not a good idea. That much money on 3 offensive players is not realistic if you want to completely rebuild the defense and offensive line. What's even crazier about this situation is that Myles Garrett single-handedly affected the Bengals in more ways than one. After holding out and threatening to demand a trade, Myles Garrett became the highest paid non-quarterback in the entire NFL, making $40 million a year. This affected the Bengals because it not only drove up the price of Jamar Chase's contract in order to make him the highest paid non-quarterback in the NFL, but it also solidified any chance that the Bengals won't extend Trey Hendrickson, which makes no sense considering he is obviously the most team-friendly and organizationally minded person in this entire situation.
I don't want to become a distraction for the team because inevitably the goal is to win a Super Bowl for Cincinnati. If it's something that we can agree on in terms, that would be great. Ideally, my wife and I would love to stay in Cincinnati.
The worst part of this entire situation is that there is a chance that Jamar Chase and T. Higgins literally holding the team hostage not only made it impossible for the Bengals to extend Trey Hendrickson, but it might have legitimately made the team worse. We're talking about a defense that ranked 25th in both points and yards allowed that has now lost its top 2 edge rushers, one being a first-team All-Pro selection, while the other finished second in Defensive Player of the Year voting. Paying 2 receivers wide receiver 1 money when you need to address your terrible defense and horrific offensive line is not a recipe for success. The Bengals already ranked 21st in cap room without the new extensions. This just makes it more difficult to address other things the team has. Joe Burrow is currently on pace to retire as the NFL's all-time completion percentage leader. As a matter of fact, if he were to retire today, he would lead the NFL in completion percentage all time. He does not need 2 wide receiver 1s. I know he got this high completion percentage with both of these wideouts on the team, but it's not like these numbers would fall off of a cliff if T. Higgins was traded. In my last video on the situation, I said the answer to this solution is obvious. You trade T. Higgins for an early draft pick, a first-round pick or a second-round pick. You depend on Andre Josevac to try to fill the void at wide receiver 2, which, by the way, in limited action last year, he showed that he was fully capable of doing at a fraction of the cost. You invest that additional cap space in offensive line and your defense, and in the first round of this year's NFL draft, if a high-end wide receiver falls to your lap, you draft him, and now you have a cheap wide receiver 2 for the next 5 years. Plus, it's not like Joe Burrow didn't want Trey Hendrickson back or anything. He was equally campaigning for him to return as well.
We need Trey back. We need to give him what he's worth and what he deserves. He's earned that.
I think it would be really easy in this situation to blame the players. You could blame Joe Burrow for being ignorant of the salary cap, but in reality, he's just campaigning for his fellow star players to get paid. You could be blaming T. Higgins and Jamar Chase for essentially holding the team hostage during these contract negotiations, but the one man who is truly at fault has barely had his name mentioned at all so far, and that's the general manager Duke Tobin, the man who's responsible for building the roster in the first place. First of all, it's not Joe Burrow's fault for knowing exactly how much cap space the Bengals have. He plays the quarterback position. Second of all, can you really blame T. Higgins and Jamar Chase for wanting to play together? Many other players go through the same thing. On top of that, T. Higgins took a pay cut to stay with the Bengals. I mean, DK Metcalf got paid $30 million a year when he got traded to the Pittsburgh Steelers. If T. Higgins accepted a trade to the New England Patriots, there's no question in my mind that he'd get paid in the mid-30s. But he opted to stay with the Bengals, take less money for guaranteed continued success. And personally, I think that's very admirable. Duke Tobin had the opportunity to extend Jamar Chase a year ago, but now after allowing these two players to hold the franchise hostage, there's no question about it that Duke Tobin just screwed over the Bengals. Now you might be wondering if this situation is fixable. Before I discuss that, I want to start out by saying this situation could have easily been avoided in many ways. Firstly, you need to extend these guys years before the final years of their contract. This is the exact same issue the Cowboys dealt with while extending Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb at the last moment last year. It's not like we didn't know that Trey Hendrickson was a star pass rusher. The guy literally had 17.5 sacks in 2023. Give him that money a year ago, and you don't have to worry about matching Max Crosby's or Myles Garrett's contract. Next, they could have done the exact same thing with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, or just not give in to the agreements to begin with. This is T. Higgins' second season in a row being franchise tagged, meaning last offseason the Bengals also had contract extension talks with T. Higgins and couldn't come to an agreement. Honestly, is paying Jamar Chase over $40 million a lot? Yes, that's more money than Sam Darnold is getting to be a quarterback this year. That's significantly more money than Justin Jefferson agreed to last year. That's $10 million more than Tyreek Hill is getting paid. I mean, wide receiver money is getting very close to star quarterback money at this point. I honestly hate to say it because I think players do deserve getting paid as much money as the general manager is willing to give them since they carry the league. But you know what? If Jamar Chase and T. Higgins want to hold your franchise hostage and say one contract won't be signed if the other doesn't get a deal, then don't negotiate with them. Or, and this is a big or just agree to trade one of them. In my opinion, Trey Hendrickson and Jamar Chase should have been signed to new contracts last season at the minimum. This would have solved two of the many major issues that the Bengals now face. I know that the way the deal is structured, technically Higgins and Chase's cap hit go down for 2025, but what then? The offensive line and defense needs so much work that a one-year rental contract isn't going to fix all of their issues. This is a team that needs to completely rebuild both their offensive and defensive lines, and instead of focusing on the trenches in the long term, they've just invested $70 million at wide receiver to pretty much have the same team come back, if not a weaker team come back. There's only one way that the Bengals can fix this disaster, and it's not something you want to depend on. It's obviously a pipe dream, but the Bengals need to draft and hit on nearly every single pick. I'm talking about the type of draft that the New York Jets had in 2022 when they selected Sauce Gardner and then Garrett Wilson and then Jermaine Johnson in the first round and then Breece Hall in the second round, or the type of draft that the Seattle Seahawks had in 2023 when they selected Devin Witherspoon, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Zach Charbonnet, or the type of draft the Houston Texans had in 2023 when they selected CJ Stroud, Will Anderson, and Tank Dell. It's obviously possible, but it's not something you fully want to depend on. And another thing the Bengals need to do in order to remain competitive is to sign those one-year rentals, and then afterwards just hope that the salary cap continues to skyrocket. I know I said signing players to one-year rental contracts won't work, and it won't work if that's all the Bengals do, but if they can do that and hit on some key draft picks, the Bengals might become competitive in 2025 and beyond. We have seen the NFL cap skyrocket over the last two off seasons, and there isn't any reason to think it will stop. The NFL just continues to grow larger and larger, meaning that the Bengals are essentially betting that it will continue to grow over the next 3 to 4 years. Although signing T. Higgins and Jamar Chase to nearly $70 million deals per year while letting your first team all-pro edge rusher potentially get traded is a horrible situation to be in, but it's not entirely impossible to work with. Hit on your draft picks, which I know is easier said than done, but after that, sign one-year rental contracts, and after being competitive in 2025, use that newfound salary cap after the cap increases in 2026 and sign more concrete players for the future. That's the only way the Bengals can make it out of their situation competitively, at least in my opinion. I know on paper those contracts seem terrible, and don't get me wrong, I agree they are, but I guess I see the vision that Duke Tobin sees for the Cincinnati Bengals. Although the vision is bleak, and I don't think it's realistic, but I understand understand where he's coming from. Let me know in the comment section down below, especially if you're a Bengals fan. What do you think about this situation? Do you think it's fixable? Aside from that, I don't know if you know this, but Cooper Kupp just made his decision, and his revenge on his former team is crazy. We have a separate video on that, and I'll leave it in the end screen. I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.